On this vote, the yeas are 229, the nays are 198, present is 1. Article 2 is adopted.
The President of the United States, Donald Trump, impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Calebs filling in for Adnan Naidu, and this is The Heat. For only the third time in U.S. history, a president of the United States has been impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. The partisan vote, with no Republicans voting to impeach President Trump, now sets up a trial in the U.S. Senate that will determine if he can remain in office. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, made the case on Wednesday for impeachment.
It is tragic that the president's reckless actions make impeachment necessary. He gave us no choice. What we are discussing today is the established fact that the president violated the Constitution. It is a matter of fact that the president is an ongoing threat to our national security and the integrity of our elections, the basis of our democracy.
But Republicans in Congress have denounced the Democrats' impeachment, saying there was no merit to the two charges, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress.
What we've seen is a rigged process that has led to the most partisan and least credible impeachment in the history of America. That is this legacy. Any prosecutor in this country would be disbarred for such blatant bias, especially if that prosecutor was the fact witness, the judge, and the jury.
Well, the matter moves next to the U.S. Senate, and that's already causing more division. Joining us now from the newsroom is CGTN correspondent OWEN FAIRCLOUGH. OWEN, what can you tell us about the battle already shaping up over impeachment in the U.S. Senate?
Well, Sean, we can take our pick, can't we, of the number of adjectives that have been used by Republicans to describe this whole process: witch hunt, persecution, and the term unfair seems rather quaint compared to those. But this is actually a crucial term in all of this, because now we're going to enter this period where Republicans and Democrats are going to really have to thrash out how they conduct this trial. We heard there, you can see Mitch McConnell, this senior Republican in the Senate, getting out of the blocks very quickly to denounce this whole inquiry. He calls it the most unfair impeachment inquiry in modern history. And as I say, there's an important element to this. These senators are expected to conduct what is considered a fair trial, but we're in an unusual situation. In a conventional criminal trial, you would expect the jurors to be impartial, and yet these senators are going to be acting as jurors, and we know they have very clearly defined political allegiances. How much does this all matter, though? Well, remember, we talk about Donald Trump being up for re-election next year, but some of those senators as well are going to be up for re-election. And how much does it matter to the American public that the Senate is seen to conduct what the American public and voters would want to see as a fair trial? That will be on the minds of some, particularly perhaps in swing states. Of course, all of this would be fairly academic. We know that the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and it's a great leap of imagination to suspect that at this stage, with the battle lines so drawn, that Democrats would be able to muster enough votes from Republicans to secure the two-thirds majority they would need to convict President Trump and remove him from office during that impeachment trial, which is expected to take place in January. Sean.
Okay, Owen, thanks very much. Now, there is so much to discuss, and joining us now here in the studio, Leonard Steinhorn. He is a political analyst and professor of communications and history at American University. With us from New York is Nate Lerner. He is co-founder and executive director of Build the Wave. Also with us here in Washington, D.C. is Frank Buckley. He is foundation professor at George Mason University's Scalia School of Law, and his new book, American Secession: The Looming Threat of a National Breakup, is coming out next month. Also joining us from Charlotte, North Carolina, is Mary C. Curtis. She's a columnist for Roll Call and an NPR contributor. Welcome to all of you. Lenny, I want to start with you. We were chatting just before we came on air. Let's talk about where we are, how we got here, the charges against U.S. President Donald Trump, basically conspiring with the Russians to, or calling Ukraine rather, to basically hold over his head, either investigate Joe Biden and his son, or will withhold this military spending. How do we get here, and you find this fascinating?
Well, it's utterly fascinating from a historical perspective. It's fascinating from a cultural perspective and from a political perspective. But bottom line here is this. The American people have been faced with a big set of evidence to be able to judge whether the president tried to engage a foreign country to interfere in our elections to undermine his chief opponent, at least what he sees as his chief opponent in 2020, and to threaten to withhold aid because of that. And that is a country that's fighting for its survival against Russia. So there are not only constitutional issues, there's issues about the integrity of our democracy, there's issues about abusing the public trust, there's issues about the integrity of his office and the presidency, there's issues about self-serving, and there's issues that are related to national security. So this is what brought the Democratic Party to be able to go and pursue impeachment. But we live in such a highly partisan era right now that regardless of the evidence, either side is going to be able to interpret it solely along the lines of what their partisan interests are, and that's what we saw in the vote yesterday in Congress.
Let's talk about that. I'd like all our panelists to listen to this, and please feel free to jump in if you have any questions or like to follow up to our various guests. But this was really characterized by some very heated rhetoric. This is extremely polarized. Here's some of the give and take on the House floor yesterday.
The evidence is clear that President Trump took advantage of Ukraine's vulnerability and abused the powers of his office to pressure Ukraine to help his re-election campaign. This is the highest of high crimes, and President Trump must be held to account.
Nowhere in the two articles of impeachment brought today does it argue that the president has committed treason, bribery, or any crime under the law. This is not overwhelming. It is not compelling. It is not bipartisan.
Nate, I want to turn to you. Let's have your reaction to this. And is there enough information to pursue impeachment? And is it also a foregone conclusion that this is, in essence, eventually perhaps going to be a waste of time because the U.S. Senate is not going to vote by 2/3 to remove Donald Trump from office?
Well, there's absolutely enough evidence. We had several career government officials and diplomats come forward and testify under oath that they believe there was a quid pro quo and that President Trump and Rudy Giuliani acted inappropriately with Ukraine, and that he clearly pressured Ukraine and withheld essential military aid in order to get them to help elect him in 2020 and help his presidential campaign. That is the definition of abuse of power. He used his office to aid his presidential campaign and convince a foreign power to help him to do so. And so that goes right in there with the first article of impeachment. And then he also pressured witnesses to not testify, and many of them did not. His administration also didn't turn over a single email or document during the impeachment inquiry. So that's clearly them obstructing the investigation as well and obstructing the inquiry, which is Article 2. So you have a clear case right there for both articles of impeachment. And, yes, the Senate is very likely going to vote against this and acquit the president. But at the same time, the House of Representatives has a constitutional duty to do their jobs and has a responsibility to the American people to do their jobs and uphold their offices by holding the president accountable, upholding the rule of law, and impeaching him when necessary. And that's exactly what they did last night. And it doesn't matter that the Senate's going to acquit him because history will remember what happened last night, and that was that Democrats did what was right for the country. And 29 Democrats who are in Trump districts that Trump won, still voted to impeach him because they put what's right for the country over their own political interests. And that's what the Democratic Party is about. Republicans, meanwhile, were very good at pretending that there was some sort of controversy. Yeah. They're very good at questioning the evidence when really providing none of their own and making a big fuss. You could give them the Oscar for it. But at the same time, their arguments were really completely empty.
Okay, Nate, Frank, if I can get you to pick up on that.
Right.
Nate made some good points. The Democrats doing their job, due diligence moving forward. But let's get your take on this, because you have a book out on secession. Does this?
Oh, it's wonderful stuff, actually. Yeah.
Does it more polarize the nation?
I hate to say, it's not an argument for secession. It's an argument that we should chill a little bit because people have exit options.
Right.
But as responding to what was said, this has been described as a great historical moment. I entirely disagree. I think that in about 3 days' time, people will say, is that all there is? because nothing else much seems to be going forward at this particular point. For the last 2 or 3 years, the Democrats have said, we really don't like Donald Trump. And yesterday they said, we really don't like Donald Trump. And that's pretty much all it is. And as for the charges of obstruction and so forth,
right,
we could argue those points, but there really was nothing there. I mean, if you wanted to mount, as one would in a trial, a real defense of Trump, you'd start looking at people like Hunter Biden and you know, the loan guarantees made to Ukraine at that particular point, which I find really quite interesting. But indeed, you don't need any of that. This is a purely political, partisan point. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't say it's undemocratic because it was voted on by a democratically elected House. But they pulled one lever, but nothing happens unless you can pull the other lever, the Senate. And because it's so hard to get a Senate impeachment, the impeachment power is roughly a dead letter.
And I know, Lenny, you want to jump in, and I want to follow that up. But Mary, I want to reach to you first, because right now, the way this is going to move, the House basically becomes the prosecution, the Senate, the jury, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Roberts, will preside over this. But Mitch McConnell and leading Republicans have made it clear they want to work in tandem with the White House. Does that damage this process?
Well, yes, it lacks a certain amount of seriousness. Well, you could see first in the House, where the Republicans were mainly arguing issues of process, and in doing so, they evoked everything from Jesus Christ and Pontius Pilate to the Salem witch trials. And now in the Senate, you have senators coming right out and saying, you know, we have made our minds up, and we're actually working with the White House. And so it's not a serious process in that sense. The public looking on this is going to look at it and say, well, you know, if I were in a jury, I would have to recuse myself, or I would have to step away if I were not fair. So that's one problem with that. And then you see, you know, they don't want to, they say it's not enough of a case, but then they don't want to call the witnesses that might clarify it, the John Boltons and the Mick Mulvaney's.
And the White House has stepped in and said, I don't want these people to testify.
Yeah, and so you could say on one point they're saying, well, we don't have enough evidence, and on the other side saying, well, these people won't be able to testify. And so they want a quick process, although now they're saying if it's drawn out, it's because Nancy Pelosi and the House, they don't have enough of a case. At this point, I do think, though, that there are those senators like Cory Gardner in Colorado, like Susan Collins in Maine, who would rather not weigh in, since they also have, are going to be involved in some very tough races. But as the previous guest said, I think the Democrats would say this isn't a political winner because the country is still deadlocked.
Absolutely.
And those moderate Democrats are going to really face, they've been in town halls and they've faced a lot of opposition, but they feel, one, that they need to do this because it's a constitutional duty of theirs and separation of powers, co-equal branches of government, and also because if something is not done, looking to 2020, it's basically saying you can go ahead and cheat if it's rewarding that. And they're looking to the next election as well.
Tough language. Frank, your response?
Well, yes, we can't permit Donald Trump to be elected again in 2020, can we? I mean, that would be clearly undemocratic, would it not?
Well,
I'm
no,
waiting to see that election, and I'm waiting to see what happens to those Democrats. I'm predicting a Republican sweep of the House next time around.
Well, let me also...
Well, it could happen. I have to say that it's not about what candidate is elected, because it's basically about, is he going to ask other foreign governments to help in his case. As it is now, you have Rudy Giuliani going around the world doing some of the behavior that, you know, he's been accused of doing, that it's been charged of doing, of wrongdoing. And so I think that, you know, they're trying to protect the integrity of elections. So,
why not just call it off? Why have an election?
Hang on. Now, I know that you want to weigh in, Lenny, but I also want to talk about what Frank has been saying, and there are Republicans out there who basically maintain since day one they've been trying to oust Donald Trump and have called this a coup. Here's some of the harsh rhetoric again that we heard yesterday.
When just because you hate the President of the United States and you can find no other reason other than the fact that you're so blinded by your hate that you can't see straight, that you've decided the only way we can make sure this president doesn't get elected again is to impeach him.
All right, so let's be clear about a few things. One, the Republicans also hated Barack Obama, okay? And they talked about all these horrible things he was doing. They would have liked to have removed him from office, but here's the problem with that. He didn't do anything to justify impeachment. That's number one. Number two, it strikes me as ironic that a very pious Republican Party is accusing the Democrats of being overly partisan in this process. Yet, the exact same Republican Party is being overly partisan in their duty in the Senate, already going in and saying that this is unfair and saying how they were going to vote before any evidence is provided. But here's the other thing. Your point earlier about what they should really be looking for, those are debunked conspiracy theories. There is no evidence. Let me finish. And it's the same as what you and your Heartland Institute do with climate change. You are climate deniers.
Oh, hell.
You deny the evidence in front of you and you refuse to accept it. There's one thing that people who have different disagreements on climate can do. They can accept the evidence and then figure out what to do with it. The problem here is that folks refuse to accept the evidence in the Republican Party, accept the evidence of what he did, and then figure out what to do with it. But just don't deny it. Don't accuse the process.
You're getting into all of that. Listen.
No, I'm not desperate. I'm trying to undermine your credibility here because you don't have it.
You're the person, you're the party with the 2-year conspiracy theory about Russia, which came up with nothing.
It didn't come up with nothing.
And when it came up with nothing, the Democrats turned on a dime and said, we'll find something else.
I want to bring Nate in. Nate, what does Donald Trump have to say about all of this? Well, he has effectively and has throughout his time in office bypassed the media. He goes to his fervent supporters in his rallies. He was in Michigan last night. I want to play you a clip of what he said last night after he found out he had been impeached.
Through their depraved actions today, crazy Nancy Pelosi's House Democrats have branded themselves with an eternal mark of shame, and it really is. It's a disgrace.
You know, Nate, and we can't lose track of what Donald Trump has been accused of and the information that has come out. Don't you think that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I'd just like to know your reaction to how Trump has effectively convinced his supporters that all of this is nonsense and is able to not be questioned about this by the media and take his message directly to the U.S. People. What has that done to this issue?
Yeah, so that's what's really remarkable about all this, and it actually brings up a point I wanted to make, is that all those Republicans we saw last night, and we just saw the clip of, who were so outraged, you know, they're clutching their pearls, they're so aghast that the Democrats could do such a thing and act such a way, and they're so confused to how, you know, this issue could even come up, and your guest there as well, you know, the thing is, they all know better. They all know what Trump did was wrong. They've known from day one that Trump was not right for this country, that he was not going to be a good president. They've known that everything that he's done has been wrong, but there are 2 reasons why they have not come out to stop him. And the first one is that he is incredibly popular within the Republican Party. Large part due to Fox News, and large part due to his personality and the campaign he's run. But he has that party really under his finger, and he can get them to come out and beat these Republicans in primary elections if they don't support him. So that's why you see Mitch McConnell so quick to back the president and so quick to just completely embarrass himself on the national stage, because guess what? In his home state of Kentucky, the Republican governor lost to a Democrat, and he has an election coming up this year in 2020, and he's very worried about losing. And so you have all these Republicans scared, and that's why they're feeble. That's why they're so quick to defend Trump. And the second reason, which is most likely why your Republican guest is backing Trump, even though he knows it's wrong, is because Trump is packing the federal courts with Republicans, and that is great news for conservatives everywhere, because those judges will be there for quite a while.
Mary, I saw you shaking your head. Your thoughts on this?
No, I was saying too, today I was listening to some of Vladimir Putin's press conference, and his speech, it sounded directly like Republican talking points on, you know, the unfairness of the impeachment proceedings against Trump, and saying that, you know, Russia had nothing to do with interfering with elections, and talking about Ukraine interfering, which is one of your guests said has been debunked. And it was fascinating that the party, as the guest just said, that used to be talking about the danger of Russia is now really talking Russian talking points. And the party has become pretty much the party of Trump. And so many of the principles on trade and deficits and so much else has really, they have capitulated to what Trump is saying, which, as he said, you can see they're afraid of being primaried, and the base is with him. And so they are going with him as well. And, you know, at that rally last night, he was just getting very personal. He personally attacked the late Congressman John Dingell and the current Congresswoman Debbie Dingell in Michigan. And you really wonder at some point how far the folks in the party and in the country are going to follow him, no matter what he says.
Frank, it's a common argument among a lot out there that Trump is basically controlling the GOP. Do you buy it?
I don't buy it. It's still importantly, sadly, I think the party, the Libertarian Party of Paul Ryan, I wrote speeches for Trump. One tried to make it different from that, and indeed to be rather more left-wing on matters of economics. But, you know, all this talk about Trump's behavior, I fully concede that he's, you know, a bully, that he's rubs a lot of people the wrong way, that he can be crude. And we don't have a parliamentary system which would filter that sort of stuff out. And what we have is a system which allows a person like that to be elected. I think the great debate on this should be not so much, let us express our hatred of Trump or the other guests on this program who defend him. Rather, what the hell is it that divides us so much that we can't get together?
It's not hatred of Trump, it's denial of evidence. And no democratic country can exist without basing its decisions on evidence. So, just like with your denial of climate change evidence, your denial of the evidence in the impeachment trial, I would much rather have a conversation where people accept the evidence and then figure out what to do with it. You know, our founders, when they created this country, they just didn't say it's based on the consent of the governed. They said it's based on the informed consent of the government. And informed consent requires evidence and knowledge.
Frank, I'm also curious, you talked about the things that you do accept about U.S. President Donald Trump. Do you accept that he's challenged telling the truth? The Washington Post details what they call falsehoods, 15,000 since he's been president. I mean, even the most ardent Republicans have to believe he has trouble telling the truth.
Well, he does, and so do most politicians. And I don't think that line to the press comes under the heading of an impeachable offense. But look, he has all of the personality defects that, that your guests find in him. And I think that when you get down to it, that's what the evidence shows, not evidence of anything more serious than that. And in fact, I should like to see a trial where the evidence of Democratic corruption is brought up with respect to Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. Yes, that would be a good thing to hear.
Okay.
But I suspect we won't, and that 3 days from now, people will wonder why were we talking about that?
Well, that's a whole different kettle of fish, and I'm sure someday we'll get down to that. Mary, one thing that Nancy Pelosi has struggled is to explain why she is delaying getting this information to the Senate for a vote. And obviously, Republicans are pouncing on that. Can you explain that and explain why it has been somewhat of an Achilles heel today?
Well, I'm not Nancy Pelosi, and I don't want to step in and try to explain why she is doing what she's doing. I do think she wants to point out the fact that there are so many witnesses that haven't been called, and that she wants to make sure it is, she has said she wants to make sure it is a fair process. And so many Republicans have come out and said that their minds are made up, that it is not a fair process. And so she wants to make that point. I do think there's some danger because the moderate Democrats who won in 2018 in Trump districts are going with her as for a while. But after a certain point, it will look like perhaps the party is playing politics, and the public will be frustrated with that and will punish them for that. So we'll see going down the line how long the rest of the party stays with her. But I think that there'll be some pressure, as I said, for that. And on the other hand, even though Mitch McConnell is pointing out that this means that they don't have a case, as I said before, there are some folks in the Senate who would be glad to not take a vote right away. And then, of course, you have the Democratic candidates who are also senators who a long trial or would have them off the campaign trail. Right. So they're eyeing this as well. I mean, they're going to be debating this week, and, not too much attention has been paid because of the impeachment.
Nate, I want to ask you that there's two schools of thought, at least coming from the Republicans, as they move toward this trial. Mitch McConnell just kind of wants to get it done, get it out of the way, and move on. Donald Trump can be called notoriously thin-skinned, and he wants his defense out there. He wants people to know his stance on this. Tell me your thoughts on those two and why you think McConnell is just pitching to have it done and out of the way.
Well, the Senate is the Republicans' opportunity to strike back, because that's where they can make their case. They can control things. They can control the narrative much more. They can control the process much more. And they can acquit Trump as quickly or as slowly as they want. And then Trump can go on the campaign trail and brag about how the Senate vindicated him and how he's been proven innocent and how this is all a farce. But what's so brilliant about Nancy Pelosi's plan is it really throws a giant roadblock in front of that and prevents it from happening. Now the Republicans are kind of stuck waiting for the ball, but if the Democrats don't have to pass it to them necessarily. And certainly the Republicans can make a big stink about it and complain and say, oh, look at the Democrats, this proves that they were wrong all the time. But hold on, that's not as good of a talking point for them as vindicating Trump and proving him innocent. And so this is actually working to the Democrats' advantage, and I think it's very brilliant of Nancy Pelosi. And honestly, if I was her, I would just never give it to them, because guess what? Last night, millions of Americans received a phone notification saying that Donald Trump was impeached. And a lot of them assumed that meant he was removed from office because they had to go Google it and see what it meant. But that sticks in their minds. And that's really effective and really powerful if you don't let them control that narrative and get what they want out of it. So I would love to see her just hold on to it and never give them the chance to spin the narrative, unless you get the White House senior staff testifying, unless you get John Bolton testifying, unless you get Donald Trump testifying, then go ahead. But until that happens, we should just hold on to it.
Guys, this is months in the making. It's difficult to discuss it in 30 minutes. We're running out of time. But Lenny, I want to get the last question to you. This is the first president that's faced impeachment that is up for re-election. He's a popular president among a huge population. What are your projections moving forward? He can still be elected president.
Well, he's aiming to turn lemons into lemonade. He's monetizing impeachment, raising tons of money off of impeachment. He's motivating his base off of impeachment. He's saying that he's the victim and that impeaching him means they're impeaching them, that all of these votes don't count, and that the so-called elites in Washington have disrespect for his supporters. The other thing that he's done, which is very successful, is he's won on impeachment because he's undermined the integrity of Joe Biden through those conspiracy theories, and those lies stick.
This is one time I wish we could keep the discussion going, but I'm sorry, we are out of time. I'd like to thank our panel and for the spirited debate. Thank you very much. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Caleb's in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for watching.